So in lieu of class today, what I wanted to do was finish up the discussion of presidential electorate politics, along with talking about the presidential dynamics of dealing with the public. And so I'm going to finish up the electoral politics. If you've got any questions on the dynamics of the presidential campaign cycle, please email me. I'll be happy to set up a Zoom session or a Collaborate session. But we're also going to look at the public dynamics, particularly in terms of presidential job approvals. And then at the end, as I noted in the Blackboard announcement, I've got 2 assignments for you to do. So you should watch this video, take notes, and then think about the 2 assignments as they relate both to this video along with the readings that we have in the Nelson book. So to kind of pick up on presidents and electoral politics, the dynamics of how presidents deal with campaigns, how they deal with elections. One of the quotes that y'all pulled out talked about voter choices, and in particularly about party loyalties, social group affiliations, short-term forces that may influence an election, like the conditions, the candidates, and the issues. And what I want to focus on in terms of thinking about this with electoral politics and presidents is the recent rise of negative partisanship. You will oftentimes hear political scientists talk about this notion of negative partisanship, particularly over the past 20 years. You may also hear it described as affective polarization. And what we mean by affective is basically attitudinal. What are the attitudes of partisan identifiers towards particularly the opposition? And one of the ways that we as political scientists study this rise of negative partisanship is trying to understand how people vote based on their partisan identification. And so over the next couple of slides here, I'm going to show data from the American National Elections Study, ANES. Now, for those folks that were in campaigns and elections, this should be pretty old hat for you. But for folks who didn't take campaigns and elections, we spent a lot of time in that particular class talking about party affiliation, the strength of that party affiliation, and then the resulting presidential vote choice. So what I've got is a couple of slides going back to 2008. And in this massive national survey done of Americans during that presidential election year, they asked a couple of basic questions. One of the first questions, how do you identify? Do you identify as a Democrat, as a Republican, or as an independent? And once they asked the questions, they asked a series of follow-up questions, particularly to the partisans. Well, if you identify as a Republican or a Democrat, how strong is your identification? Would you say that it's very strong, not strong? What ways would you describe yourself in terms of the strength of your partisan identification? And you'll notice the 2 left columns and the 2 right columns, strong partisans going into not strong partisans. If somebody identified as an independent on that first question, the follow-up question would be, well, do you lean to one party or the other? Meaning, if you identify as an independent, do you lean sometimes to the Democrats or do you lean sometimes to the Republicans? Or are you a pure independent? You don't lean to one party over the other. Now you'll notice some numbers underneath each category on the screen. Those represent the percentage of the national electorate. So nationally in 2008, 23% of all the voters identified as strong Democrats. You go all the way over to the right, 17% identified as strong Republicans. And then you can move your way into the middle. Notice among pure independents, only 5% of the electorate in 2008 said, no, I'm a pure independent. The next question that was asked was, well, how did you then vote? Did you vote for Barack Obama, John McCain, or a third party? And not surprisingly, we should expect the strong partisans to be the most loyal to their presidential candidates. And indeed, that was the case. For both strong Democrats and strong Republicans, basically 95% of those partisan identifiers voted for their particular presidential candidate. When you get into the not strong, or sometimes referred to as weak partisans, that support level drops, but it drops not as much as we would think, into the mid-80s for both Democrats and Republicans. Yes, there is an increase of partisan identifiers who vote for the other party. 14% of not strong Democrats voted for John McCain. 12% of not strong Republicans voted for Barack Obama. But consistently, we tend to see among the partisan identifiers, those who say off the bat, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, 85% or greater, they are going to vote for their party's presidential candidate. Now we get into the independents. And first we'll start with the independent leaders. Among independent-leaning Democrats and among independent-leaning Republicans, you're basically talking again about 80% or greater. Notice among independent Democrats, it's almost 90%, more so than those Democrats who identify as a Democrat but are not as strong as some of those strong Democrats. Among independent Republicans, 10 points less than what we saw with the not strong Republicans, but that, I think, is an anomaly as we'll see in 2012 and 2016. Now let's move to the independents. How do they tend to see themselves, and how did they vote in 2008 presidential election? Well, a majority, 51%, voted for Barack Obama, McCain 40%. So in looking at this slide overall, the way that political scientists interpret this is basically if you identify as a partisan in some way, shape, or form, either independent leaning or an actual partisan, you can pretty much look at 80% or more of them voting for their party's presidential candidate. Now let's move into 2012. The same kind of questions, same kind of dynamics. Again, you see the electorate spread out. This time, pure independents jumped from 5 to 9% of the electorate. But think about that. Basically, 90% of the electorate identifies with one political party in some way, shape, or form. And among the strong partisans, even greater numbers. Almost 100% of them voted for their political party's candidate. Among the weak partisans, over 80% of them voted for their particular political party's presidential candidate. Among the independent leaners, just about or slightly more of them voted for their party's presidential candidate. When you get into the pure independents, slightly more voted for Barack Obama, but notice a pattern of third-party support. At the strong partisan levels, 1 or 0%. But as you move towards the middle, third parties tend to rise. That's an interesting phenomenon that's been fairly consistent. But notice less than 15% of pure independents, the greatest group, voting third party, but only less than 15%. Now we get into 2016. Two highly polarized presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, same dynamics. Strong partisans, overwhelmingly for their party's presidential candidate. Among the not strong partisans, actually drops into the mid-70s. So basically 3/4 of weak partisans, not strong Democrats, not strong Republicans, voting for their particular presidential candidate. Among the independent leaners, 80% were voting for the party, the presidential candidate of the party that they lean to. Among independents, what is surprising here is 23%, nearly a quarter of them, voted third party. And that may show partly the disgust with both Trump and Clinton as presidential candidates. Notice that basically 78% voted partisan, but 23% voted third party. Now, another way to think about political polarization that political scientists think about is, again, talking about this idea of negative partisanship. How do we view the opposition party in relationship to how people view their own political party? And within the 2016 ANES survey, there was a question asked, is there anything that you like about the Democratic Party? And is there anything that you like about the Republican Party? And again, breaking it down, by party identification and strength of party, you'll see some familiar patterns emerge. Among the strong partisans, 85% of strong Democrats said, yeah, there's something that I like about the Democratic Party. Only 18% of strong Democrats said that there was anything that they liked about the opposition, the Republican Party. Not surprisingly, the same dynamic in the opposition. Amongst strong Republicans, 86% said that there was something that they liked about their political party. Again, less than 20% of strong Republicans said that there was anything that they liked about the Democratic Party. As you move towards the middle, not strong partisans, a little bit less liking of their own political party, a pretty good drop from 80s, the mid 80s, down to basically 60%, and a slight bump up of about 10 percentage points among liking something in the opposition party. Independent Democrats, independent Republicans, just as, if not more, liking something about their political party that they lean to. But again, a slightly higher number of those folks who see something that they like about the opposition. Among independent-leaning Democrats, 39% said there was something they liked about Republicans. Among independent-leaning Republicans, almost a third said there was something they liked about the Democrats. Well, what about the folks in the middle? The independents, the pure independents. Is there anything that they like about the Democratic Party or the Republican Party? Not a lot. Only a quarter, barely a quarter of independents said that there was something that they liked about either the Democratic or the Republican Party. So part of this, we'll have to wait and see what the 2020 numbers look like. But it will be interesting to compare 2016 with two very polarizing presidential candidates and the views of the political party, and have they hardened any over Trump's administration and perhaps depressed the numbers supporting the statement there was something I liked about the opposition party, and perhaps increasing things about their own party. We'll just have to wait and see what those numbers look like. The other way to think about partisan loyalty and partisan support is to kind of take a historic view. Again, this is American National Election Studies data, but this goes back to 1952 with Dwight Eisenhower's presidential run against Adlai Stevenson as a Democrat, all the way up to 2016. Again, we don't have the 2020 numbers, but it'll be interesting to put this into context. And what I basically did was take each of these elections and how did each of these three groups, independent Democrats, weak Democrats, strong Democrats, how did they support their party's presidential candidates? Among independent Democrats, you'll notice some real variation going on. That first blue chart bar is the 1952 contest between Democrat Adlai Stevenson and Republican Dwight Eisenhower. And you'll notice Stevenson only gets about 60% support among independent Democrats. But you'll see two other key elections. The first in 1968, Hubert Humphrey barely got a half of the support from independent Democrats. And then in 1980, when Jimmy Carter was running for re-election against Ronald Reagan, he got less than 50% support among independent Democrats. But notice the past 7 bars, the past 7 presidential elections, where we see a real increase moving into basically the 90s when it comes to support by independent Democrats for independent presidential candidates. Among the weak Democrats, again, you'll see variations playing itself out. One of the most notable ones was 1972 among weak Democrats. That was Richard Nixon, a Republican, running for re-election against the Democrat George McGovern. McGovern was highly unpopular. Richard Nixon was fairly popular, but McGovern was not as popular among Democrats. And we see this with less than 50% support among weak Democrats. But notice again, perhaps the last 5-6 presidential bars there, presidential election bars, it's well over 80% support among weak Democrats. Among strong Democrats, fairly more consistent, but again, that dip in 1972 as among weak Democrats. But notice when we get into the most recent presidential elections, almost close to 100% support from strong Democrats to Democratic presidential candidates. Do the same thing for Republicans. Republican identification and support for Republican candidates. Among independent Republicans, we see the dips, as we saw among Democrats, not as great. One of the key ones, 1992. That was when George H.W. Bush was running for re-election. He was facing a sluggish economy. He also faced a pretty strong third-party candidacy in Ross Perot. And while Perot pulled from both Democrats and Republicans, it was believed that the Republicans defected at greater numbers to Perot and against George H.W. Bush. Among weak Republicans, again, you'll see the dips. In 1964, that's Barry Goldwater and his controversial run for the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Weak Republicans dropped below 60%. And again, in 1992, much like with independent Republicans, weak Republicans deserted George H.W. Bush. Among strong Republicans, they are perhaps the most loyal individuals. The lowest dip was indeed 1992, again for George H.W. Bush, but they are consistently almost 100% supporting the presidential candidates. So this should give you an idea of how partisanship plays a role in terms of electoral politics and how presidents can benefit, particularly recent presidents, can benefit basically from party loyalty playing itself out. Now I want to go into a discussion on presidents and publics. And here one student had noted that job approval ratings of presidents almost always decline as their administration progresses. This is what is oftentimes referred to as the decay curve. And what we as political scientists, in terms of thinking about presidential job approval ratings, want to think about how we might see this play out. And certainly we will have a number of polls that will be coming out, particularly about the Biden administration. But one of the key things that we're seeing is, are there differences within party identification when it comes to job approval ratings? We saw about vote choices and the differences between partisan identifiers and independents. But could we see this potentially play out when it comes to job approval ratings? So what I'm going to give you is the dynamics of the George W. Bush presidential administration, the 2 terms, Barack Obama's 2 terms, and then the single term for Donald Trump. And again, kind of see how this plays out in terms of the dynamics of job approval ratings. Now, we're going to start off with George W. Bush, all adults. And again, this is Gallup poll data. The black line that's basically cutting your screen in half is the 50% mark. Most presidents want to be over 50%. They don't want to be under 50%, or worse yet, have their approval ratings lower than their disapproval ratings. Sometimes you will hear the term, the president is underwater. That means that his approval rating is lower than his disapproval rating. And so with George W. Bush, we see a real decay curve at play here. Notice you will see a real spike. Early on in his administration, he was bouncing over 50%, but he spiked up to 90%. Well, that was due to a critical event, 9/11. Now, you'll notice over time, it drops down. It bounces back up. That was at the beginning of the Iraq War. But you'll notice over the remainder of his presidential administration, while there are various spikes at times, he really settles into a decay curve, moving below 50% in his second administration and basically ending up in the low 30s by the time he left office. Now, this is all adults, but again, we have the beauty of breaking out by partisan identification. Here's George W. Bush among Republicans. Notice you will see a very high approval rating consistently until he hits basically about 3/4, 2/3, 3/4 into his 2 terms in office. And you start to see the decay curve play itself out. Now, you'll notice he had, by the end, a bounce back up, general favorability of a departing president among partisans. But notice, partisans never dipped below 50% for George W. Bush among Republicans. Now here's Democrats and their sense of approval of George W. Bush. A bounce up, certainly like the rest of the nation, but notice early on in his administration, he was below 50%, basically bouncing around in the 30s. But the bounce up did not last as long, and it tended to drop even further to where basically by the end of his administration, Democrats had about a 10% approval rating of George W. Bush. Now, among independents, Gallup doesn't necessarily divide out the leaners. So we have this pool of not necessarily pure independents, but independents, pure independents, and the leaners. And here's their approval ratings over time of George W. Bush. You can almost kind of think about this through the lens of independents are really in between the two, partisans, Republicans, and Democrats. But what we are seeing here play out is certainly the decay curve. By the time we get into the second term of the Bush administration, he's basically into the 30s, low 40s when it comes to independents supporting and giving an approval of George W. Bush. So now we move on to Barack Obama. All adults. And here we see a very different pattern from George W. Bush. Basically, Barack Obama is hugging that 50% line. Yes, he drops down into the low 40s at times. Yes, he bounces over 50%. You'll notice early on in his administration, he had a fairly high approval rating. Not as high as George W. Bush, but then again, we didn't have the kind of cataclysmic 9/11 event that rallied the country behind Barack Obama. But over time, he basically was fairly consistent in hugging around that 50% mark. Among partisans, Barack Obama's job approval rating among Democrats, yes, there's some variation, but it was consistently high. Typically, he never bounced below 75% approval among Democrats. However, among Republicans, consistently down into the 20s, oftentimes, sometimes dipping down into the teens. Among independents, fairly consistent, more like the all adults numbers, but slightly more down than necessarily hugging that 50%. But notice by the end, he's almost at the same pattern of approval as when he started. So we've got two comparisons between George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Now let's look at Donald Trump in terms of all adults. For his one term of office, he had on one occasion, I believe it hit almost 49%, but he never made it over 50% in terms of approval ratings. He started off below 50%. And most presidents tend to have a job approval early on of at least 50%. At least half the country seems to like the president, even though he really hasn't done anything at that particular point in time. He had none of that and was consistently below 50%. Yet among partisans, among Republicans, Trump approval well over 50%. Among Democrats, basically 20% or less. And then among independents, consistently below 50%. So I think what these three presidents tell us is that certainly we have seen the decay curve play out, particularly in George W. Bush's presidency, but I think we have moved much more into partisanship, in particularly Barack Obama's and now Donald Trump's. And it will be interesting to see how Joe Biden's approval numbers tend to play out. So, at the end here, what I'd like for you to do is in Blackboard, post two discussion board posts. The first, describe your analysis of what party identification means for the modern presidency when it comes to both voting patterns in terms of support for presidential candidates and also job approval. This focus on party identification, I think, is an important component of American politics. So give me your sense, your feedback of what you see developing as I presented in these slides when it comes to the modern presidency. For your second discussion post, taking what you now know about party identification in the modern presidency, discuss at least 6 to 8 points from the Nelson readings regarding how modern presidents should communicate to the public. What you may want to think about is, what is the public? Who defines what the public is, and can the president see different versions of what the public is? Make sure to point out and discuss at least one point from each of the readings in pages 269 to 296. And again, as a reminder, make sure to post these discussions in Blackboard by 5 p.m. Friday. I hope everybody has a good weekend. We will pick up with the readings scheduled for next Tuesday. I'll open up those discussion board posts for those readings, and hopefully we'll be back on track in terms of the schedule in the syllabus. Hope everybody has a good weekend.